The death of Sinwar, in and of himself, is also a really significant development. He was the last remaining veteran military leader within the Hamas leadership. So that loss by itself is potentially a game changer in terms of the immediate dynamic on the ground. There will have been a line of succession. There will have been plans put in place for whenever he was killed. So short story is the Israelis have been capable, but they've also set the condition that will allow Hamas to fight for another day.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI. Over the past month, Iran and its regional network of allies and proxies, the so-called Axis of Resistance, has suffered a string of dramatic losses and defeats, from the beeper and walkie-talkie attacks that maimed or killed hundreds of Hezbollah operatives to the killings of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and Hamas head Yahya Sinwar, to assassinations of IRGC commanders in Damascus and Beirut. The Axis appears to be on the back foot. Meanwhile, the region is waiting for Israel's promised retaliatory strike against Iran itself. Some analysts have begun to ask whether the Axis of Resistance will survive the wars in Lebanon and Gaza. But are the triumphalist narratives about the Israeli military efforts premature? What is the future of the Axis and its members, and what can the US and its allies do to confront and disrupt this Iranian-led network? In part one of a two-part episode, I sit down with three regional experts who assess the state of the Axis and its future prospects by looking at the network's most important non-state members, including Lebanese Hezbollah, Hamas in Gaza, the Yemeni Houthis, and pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and Syria. Randa Slim heads MEI's program on conflict resolution and Track 2 dialogues. Charles Lister, the director of MEI's Syria and the Countering Terrorism and Extremism programs, as well as Fatima Abo Alasrar, a non-resident scholar with the Arabian Peninsula Affairs program. Welcome, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Hi, Matt. Good to be with you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, Randa, first question to you. How serious of a blow has Hezbollah been dealt over the past month? How degraded are its capabilities? And how has this affected the group's standing and level of influence inside of Lebanon?
Those were very serious blows, especially the assassination of the Secretary General, Hassan Nasrallah. He was a charismatic figure. He has had a long term, more than 30 years. He has shaped the organization around basically his persona and his inner team. And he has commanded high levels of respect and support from the rank and file inside Hezbollah, but also from the wider Shia community. And so his assassination is really a major blow. Add to that, basically the Israelis wiped out most the military command of Hezbollah. And these are people who have been part of the founding core of Hezbollah. And so they have a lot of accumulated experience. They have a lot of trust between them, how they work together. And this has been, totally now eliminated. It doesn't mean that the party cannot recover and the military wing of the party has not recovered or will not recover. But I think it's going to be a long, hard slog for them to get to the state they were in pre-September 27, when the Secretary General was assassinated. Hezbollah is the linchpin of the resistance axis. And so what happens to Hezbollah has repercussions over the modus operandi as well as the whole inner workings of the Iran-led resistance axis. And so you are going to expect that in the short term, you're going to see more of command and control being taken over by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And we are already hearing of such a development taking place in Beirut. But at the same time, we are hearing reports of Hezbollah starting to recruit fighters again. And so the organization has been definitely weakened, but it's down, but it is not out. The long-lasting impact on the inner workings of the party has to do with two impacts, if we can put it this way. The first is the trust level among the rank and file, between the commanders and the rank and file. And I think this has been dealt a serious blow by the pagers attack, the walkie-talkie attack, the realization that the party has been seriously infiltrated by Israeli intelligence, not signals intelligence, but definitely human intelligence, and that they have spies in their ranks. And so that erodes to some level the trust, which is the glue that binds this organization together and the different levels of the organization. And the second impact, in my opinion, is this compact that has developed over the years between Hezbollah and their larger milieu within especially the Shia community of Lebanon. And the compact has been, we support you as constituents, we elect your parliamentarians, we send our kids to fight with you, we contribute, to your finances, but you will then help defend us from Israeli aggression, but also from domestic opponents, and you will help deter Israel. And I think this invasion of southern Lebanon and the ongoing destruction of whole villages, which were mostly, Shiite villages. There are also mixed villages, Christian and Shia. There are also Sunni parts of the Lebanese society living in these villages. But for the most part, the south of Lebanon and the northeast of Lebanon, which is being attacked now by Israel, is mostly Shia majority. And these are core supporters of Hezbollah. And so the fact that now Hezbollah is not able to deter, but not able to defend these villages from this total destruction is also raising, not doubts, but eroding some of that relationship between them. And time will tell if Hezbollah as a political party, but also as a militant organization, is able to regain that trust from its supporters and is able to lend credence to this narrative, which they have always advanced, which is that their weapons, their paramilitary status in Lebanon, is primarily there to defend their constituents, to defend Lebanon from Israeli aggression.
You've mentioned the word trust a lot in terms of internal trust between the rank and file and the command inside of Hezbollah. Can you speak a bit more about the consequences of the Israeli campaign on Hezbollah and how that's affected the level of mutual trust and working relationship between Hezbollah and Tehran itself?
That's a very interesting question, because definitely there must be suspicion that some of that infiltration of Hezbollah's operation has come from compromised services inside Tehran, especially after Ismail Haniyeh assassination, which showed the level of Israeli intelligence penetration of Iranian governance structures, Iranian intelligence sectors, Iranian security sectors. And even before that, the ability of the Israelis to assassinate the deputy defense minister, to assassinate nuclear scientists in Tehran also has shown over time how this level of penetration by Israeli intelligence of Iranian security services and intel services has not been dealt with. And so there is now increasing concern among Hezbollah leadership that the Israeli infiltration of Hezbollah really has started with infiltration of Iranian services, and especially, for example, revelation about the whereabouts of their Secretary General. When he was assassinated, he was meeting with a commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and the thinking goes that because the access of certain services inside Tehran to the meeting, the timing, the place of the meeting, that also gave Israel intelligence and enabled it to carry that the assassination, which killed both the Secretary General of Hezbollah and the Iranian commander. But the relationship between Hezbollah and the IRGC particularly goes back decades. It's stacked, at different levels of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, but also the Iranian leadership. It goes all the way up to the office of the Supreme Leader. But I think that relationship between them is very, very, very old. It's based on different layers of contacts that have accumulated over years. That trust level that exists between them might have been hurt momentarily or for the short term, but in the long term, it's not going to undermine or upend the relationship that exists between Tehran, the IRGC, and Hezbollah. And anyway, Hezbollah has no other bigger supporter than the IRGC and the Supreme Leader. They cannot rely on anybody else right now, especially now, for support, not only military, political, organizational. So they have nowhere else to go.
There is reportedly a debate inside Hezbollah rethinking the strategy of tying the group to Hamas's cause in Gaza. How likely is such a decoupling, particularly against the backdrop of Israel's escalating war in Lebanon? And what would that mean for the cohesion of the axis of resistance and the network's future utility for Iran?
I think the decoupling has started. I think the speech that was given recently by the Deputy Secretary General of Hezbollah, Naim Qassem, was written in a way to decouple without publicly admitting the decoupling. And partly it is difficult for, especially now for Hezbollah, to admit the decoupling publicly, to state it unambiguously, because the coupling was put forward by the late Secretary General, Hassan Nasrallah. It's part of Hezbollah's modus operandi that once a policy or a position is put forward publicly by the Secretary General, it's very hard to back away from it, because this position has been reached after deliberation within the party as well as with Tehran. And it takes time to get to that point of advancing a particular policy publicly. But at the same time, now with the demise of former Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, I think that gives the party freedom to at least send mixed signals, if we can put it this way. But the recent speech by Naim Qassem, as far as I interpret it, is that there is an indirect decoupling having taken place between the Lebanon front and the Gaza front. Although in the beginning of the speech, he talked about the ideological battle being the same, the battle for liberation of Palestine and the liberation in support of Gaza, along with the battle on the Lebanese-Israeli front. He went on to say that starting September 17, the war of support that Hezbollah has been conducting since October 8, 2023, in support of Gaza and of Hamas, has now shifted to a war of liberation of Lebanese lands and defense of Lebanese lands. So that is already an admission that unity of fronts between Gaza and Lebanon is no longer there. So the decoupling has taken place. And then more interestingly, when he was talking about ceasefire and that should be the first step, he did not mention Gaza. And already they have said that the Speaker of the Parliament, Nabih Berri, is now their big brother, is the one who speaks on their behalf, with international entities, be it the US government or be it all European governments or be it the UN. And Nabih Berri has already said that those two fronts have been decoupled and that now the focus is on defending and ending the Israeli war on Lebanon. What does it mean? That decoupling decision would not have been made by Hezbollah without approval by Iran and Tehran. And so these big decisions, especially when it comes to war and peace issues with Israel, these decisions are made in total coordination with Tehran. And in fact, the one person who has veto power over these decisions in terms of stopping them or approving them is the supreme leader in Iran.
Charles, turning to you, let's back up a bit. How have the Axis of Resistance members supported one another prior to October 7th, 2023, versus after the start of the Gaza war and now, since Israel's stepped-up campaign against Hezbollah?
Well, they've been described as an axis or as a network of like-minded non-state actors for a reason, and that's because they're all united more or less by one kind of cohesive agenda and one cohesive regional relationship, which is obviously one that goes through Iran. Prior to October the 7th, it was a relationship I would probably describe as one of solidarity, although each of these, if we call them proxies, each of these proxies has their own unique national agendas too, and we shouldn't forget that. So their primary agendas are domestic or nationally oriented, but they do share this regional agenda. There is communication between them. There has been weapons transfer. There's clearly finance and logistics relationships that are coordinated primarily by Iran, but to an extent also by Hezbollah from Lebanon. But that regional solidarity through that shared agenda in combating Israel and fighting the United States presence in the Middle East has been that sort of shared agenda item. Since October the 7th, I would just say all of that sort of shared solidarity has been on steroids. It's just been intensified significantly. The war in Gaza, Palestinian suffering in Gaza has exacerbated or strengthened that solidarity very significantly. It has seen each of these various proxy actors mobilize both individually but also collectively in support of that shared agenda. We haven't necessarily seen a great deal of Iranian hands in manipulating that, but that is by design. These proxies were propped up and mobilized and strengthened so that they could play these roles both individually and collectively in a scenario just like what we've seen since October the 7th.
And how are Iran's other regional proxies, especially in Syria and Iraq, reacting to the war in Lebanon that is unfolding now?
The militias in Iraq and secondarily in Syria they've been mobilized through that shared solidarity. We saw particularly from October until early February, so October 2023 to February 2024, a very intensive campaign of rocket and drone attacks targeting American troops stationed in Iraq and Syria. Well over 180 of those attacks took place in that first roughly 6-month period, with the aim being to try to expel American forces from the region, to undermine local confidence in Baghdad and in northeastern Syria about the sustainability of a US presence. And of course, we've since seen a bilateral security arrangement between Iraq and the US, whereby US forces are now scheduled to at least draw down from Iraqi soil. So to an extent, you could argue from the perspective of the militias that some of that agenda has been achieved. Interestingly, just in the last few weeks, in the last month or so, we've seen a sudden uptick again in those attacks. So they pretty much stopped in early February. There was a sort of unofficial ceasefire that was the result of a kind of coercive American diplomacy in Baghdad. But those attacks have resumed over the last few weeks. So we've had 12 attacks in the last 4 weeks or so. And that risks putting us back in a place where we were in that earlier period after October the 7th, where frankly the US and these Iranian proxies were locked in a very dangerous spiral of hostilities, tit for tat attacks and airstrikes from the US. And we've already seen, just to close out this answer, a number of undeclared or unacknowledged US airstrikes against these proxies in Syria over the last couple of weeks in a clear response to these attacks. But interestingly, for the first time, we're not seeing those American airstrikes publicly acknowledged. So there's clearly also a lot of back channeling going on behind the scenes, presumably mostly in Baghdad, attempting to put a stop to this before it gets more out of control.
It's been over a year since the war in Gaza began. Israel's stated goal from the very beginning was to eliminate the Hamas threat. We've now heard that the Israeli military has killed the group's military leader in Gaza and the so-called architect of the October 7th attacks, Yahya Sinwar. How would you assess the effectiveness of Israel's campaign, and what does all of this mean for the future of Hamas and the axis of resistance?
Yes, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I would start by saying that big picture, Hamas has clearly been dealt an almighty blow over the last year, notwithstanding much of the criticism and the concerns around how the Israeli campaign has been fought in Gaza. Hamas has lost a great deal. Its command and control infrastructure has been destroyed. Much of its leadership has been taken out now, including Yahya Sinwar, the architect, as you say, of the October 7th attack. So it has been dealt a mighty blow. It has been devolved from being a governing entity with, a rudimentary standing army to a dispersed insurgency in a territory that is mostly rubble now. The rubble bit there, I think, is important because in terms of long-term assessments, I think the mass destruction that we've seen in Gaza, the lack of realistic thinking around the day after, whenever this conflict does finally end, probably means that Hamas's future is more or less secure. It will look different than it looked before October the 7th, no doubt about that, but they will live to fight another day. I worry also that the more religious extremist side of their ideology, because of course there is also a nationalist bent to it, but the extremism will have been exacerbated by what we've seen over the last year and the extremity of the conflict. The death of Sinwar, in and of himself, is also a really significant development. He was the last remaining veteran military leader within the Hamas leadership. So that loss by itself is potentially a game changer in terms of the immediate dynamic on the ground. But, his appointment as Hamas's overall leader as well as political chief just a few months ago will have meant that everyone in Hamas knew that his life had a date on it. So there will have been a line of succession. There will have been plans put in place for whenever he was killed. So, short story is the Israelis have been capable, but they've also set the conditions that will allow Hamas to fight for another day. The war in and of itself will also continue in some form, I think, for quite some time. This is just what we've seen witnessed in Gaza is a much more extreme version of what Israel has long called a mowing the grass strategy, which is that they have slammed their Hamas adversaries into the ground, but been incapable of imposing that strategic and irreversible defeat, which means that, the cycle of violence will continue, albeit perhaps in a different form in the years to come.
Fatima, you've been studying the rise and evolution of the Houthis in Yemen as a player with increasingly region-wide reach and as a member of Iran's axis. We've seen this most dramatically with their missile strikes against Israel and their attacks on shipping in the Red Sea that they have said they will not stop until Israel ends its war in Gaza. So, first question, what are the Houthis' goals in supporting Hamas and the Palestinian cause?
Well, the Houthi support for the Palestinian cause goes beyond just agreeing with Hamas or wanting to just support Palestinians or, stop Israel. It's a strategic move, First of all, they're aiming to gain legitimacy in the region by saying that they can act on behalf of the Palestinian cause, which resonate deeply with Arabs everywhere. They're trying to sort of shed their image as just a, Yemeni rebel group and present themselves as defenders of a pan-Arab issue. And this is huge. It's not just talk. They've also backed up their words with actions. So since October 2023, they've been launching missiles and drones towards Israel in response to the Israel-Hamas conflict. But this was a big deal because it showed that they were willing to take direct action for the Palestinian cause, even from Yemen. So their anti-Israeli stance also helps them somewhat portray themselves as part of this bigger Arab struggle against what they see as Western imperialism. It's a way to gain support from both inside and outside Yemen. They have been actively collecting donations for this cause, which also goes to supporting their military effort. And they're collecting even these donations from Yemenis and influential Yemeni businessmen, adding other taxes and justifying that to support their brothers and sisters in Palestine. Recently, Abdel al-Houthi, their kind of supreme leader, speeches have been just in totality about Palestine, Israel, about U.S. complicity in aiding Israel in all of its campaign and saying, so sort of like justifying their role as axis of resistance members, that they're acting on behalf of the downtrodden and the people who are affected by what's happening, that they're standing up for Gaza when it's actually they're just completely standing up with Hamas.
Opening up the aperture a bit more, how much have the Houthis relied on support from the other Axis of Resistance members and from Tehran?
I would say, that support has been quite significant. I know that so many people see the Houthis as independent because, they have some kind of legitimacy from Yemen. They have their own historical grievances. But, it's important to be clear here. The Houthis are really heavily reliant on Iran and on other axis of resistance members, especially when it comes to military capabilities. So the idea that they're independent actors, that's really misleading. Iran has been crucial in providing the weapons, the military expertise, the political support. And without this backing, the Houthis probably couldn't have sustained their military campaign against the Saudi-led coalition for the past 10 years. The UN panel of experts for Yemen reported that the Houthis have been acquiring weapons and technologies similar to those produced to Iran. They've specifically mentioned the Houthis' use of drones, of waterborne IEDs, which showed exactly the same characteristics, similar to the weapon systems inspected and seized by member states. Weapons are being smuggled and seized regularly. The IRGC as well and Hezbollah provided the technical know-how and the training. There's been video evidence of that, In 2018, we've seen, Hezbollah operatives training Houthi fighters in Yemen, teaching them advanced warfare, and all of that was really caught on video. But it's really important to understand that the missile capabilities for the Houthis, it's the area where Iran's support has been absolutely crucial. So they have helped them develop these ballistic missile technology, enable them to strike all of the targets, starting from Saudi Arabia. So all of the Qasif ones, some mods, etc. It has, sometimes the Yemeni names, but it's really something that has been manufactured and assisted in Iran. So it's just kind of clear Iran and the Houthis are very, very closely aligned, as well as the rest of the Axis of Resistance members. So the Iran provides the financial and military support, and the Houthis, they just get a powerful friend with deep pockets, with a steady supply of weapon, and a platform to basically disseminate their message.
The regional situation has changed dramatically since the Israeli turned to focus on eliminating Hezbollah. You've spoken a bit about Hezbollah's role in helping to arm and train the Houthis. But beyond that, how do the Houthis see the plight of Hezbollah for their own fortunes?
When it comes to Hezbollah, the Houthis sort of see them as a role model. They've been watching Hezbollah struggles and successes really very closely. Abdul Malik al Houthi, he's trying to position himself as a major player in this broader regional resistance movement. He's a very charismatic speaker, really good with words. He regularly emphasizes solidarity with Hezbollah and Hamas in his speeches. I remember, and I wrote about this a couple of years ago. Abdul Malik gave a speech where he directly praised Hezbollah's, former leader Hassan Nasrallah, calling him a great holy warrior. And I think in some ways he aspires now to be that holy warrior now that Nasrallah is gone. So it was not just about flattery; it was about aligning himself with a successful leader. And here's the interesting part. Abdul Malik's speeches are often more like currently now and after October 7th, they're more aggressive than what I've seen from Hezbollah. So basically in the Israel-Hamas conflict, even they were front and center in starting to launch the attack on the Red Sea and even on Israel when Hezbollah and Iran were just sort of like waiting to see what the response would be. But the Houthis were acting first, recklessly. So this willingness to take bold action, it's enhancing Abdul Malik's role as a contender for leadership within the axis of resistance. His influence has significantly grown beyond Yemen. There are parts of his speeches that are being broadcasts in Lebanon and Iraq that are completely aligned with Hezbollah. So in a sense, it's not just about following Hezbollah's playbook. They're trying to outdo them in some ways, hoping that this will boost their own standing in the region. And if Abdul Malik al-Houthi, managed to get this type of role, this backing from Iran, and as you can see, eyes are starting to shift from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen. Of course, we're kind of like momentarily distracted by the countries that are the significant threat to Israel. And of course, the Houthis are more of a nuisance because most of their attacks have just done really nothing. But it's probably they're banking on exactly that maybe the majority of the destruction or Israel's immediate anger is going to be focused on its neighbors, which will allow the Houthis some kind of breathing room because you really can't eliminate them. If Israel is successful in taking someone like Abdul Malik al-Houthi, that would be devastating for the entire movement. But it's less likely because no one knows his whereabouts. So the fact that he can assume that role, become the other leader that people listen to, it's something that can transform this movement, have it control all of Yemen, and that will definitely then allow Iran to have access to Bab al-Mandab.
So you say that the Houthis believe they might be able to take on the role that Hezbollah has played within the axis of resistance, a leadership role. Do you believe that they, in fact, could do this? And relatedly, I mean, do their goals align closely enough with Iran's, or Iran to be happy with that sort of new situation?
Yes. I mean, the first part of your question, Hassan Nasrallah was the biggest figure in Hezbollah. You know, his profile was already there. He was known within Hezbollah, within the Shia community, and in the entire Arab world. He was this amazing, charismatic leader for a lot of Arabs, even Sunni Arabs, you know, sort of like, you know, listen to him because he had this gravitas. There are contenders in Hezbollah, but are they as known? Are they as respected? Do we know how they communicate? There is a strong trail for Abdel Malik al-Houthi, and I think that enables him regionally to become more important. So whatever he's going to broadcast regionally is going to have like greater implications on our security, US foreign policy. We're going to start really following him more closely right now. And before he was seen as a follower. Now he's going to be the agenda setter. And honestly, most of this agenda is, yes, it's coming from Iran. Houthis' goals are pretty closely intertwined with Iran's broader regional strategy. Sure, the Houthis are focused on consolidating power, as I just said, in Yemen, but it's not the end game. It's more like a stepping stone in Iran's regional plan. So if they gain control over Yemen, they are helping further Iran's strategic goals and help them expand their influence towards Bab el-Mandeb, which is, you know, it's a critical choke point, maritime choke point. And it's important to note that, you know, their relationship with Iran is not just partnership. It's heavily dependent on Iran. They're playing a subordinate role in Iran's regional designs. Looking at their actions in the Red Sea, they have managed to stifle majority of the ships and trades around there, including oil tankers, which again benefits who? It benefits Iran. I mean, yes, sure, it's all about supporting you know, quote unquote Gaza, but ultimately what they're doing is they're stifling the trade routes and the oil routes, and maybe forcing the international community to consider their relationship with Iran, which could also be a supplier for oil for very cheap.
And Charles, last question to you. Given what we've discussed, how would you characterize the axis of resistance network in terms of its durability and effectiveness? And how can the US and its regional allies more effectively disrupt the axis?
It's a good couple of questions. I mean, the shared agenda I talked about earlier will always exist. There's no getting away from that. And Iran forming the kind of glue that molds it all together, that's also not going away anytime soon either. So in terms of your question around durability, if that is the core skeleton or architecture around which the so-called axis of resistance sustains itself, then it's not going away, because the shared agenda will always be there. Having said that, I think what Israel has shown, particularly in Lebanon over the last few weeks, is that with extremely good intelligence and a willingness to do what nobody really ever expected them to do, it is possible to deal very significant blows to the most powerful of these organizations by targeting their senior leadership, right from the very top all the way down. It's an open question as to how significant, though, that sort of quote unquote leadership decapitation will prove to be. I think we're in the very early days of what could be a very messy conflict in Lebanon, particularly with Israeli troops on the ground. But in theory, what the Israelis have managed to accomplish in those early phases was very significant. So it's an open question, really, the first part of your question. We will be yet to see how durable some of those most powerful proxies like Hezbollah will prove to be under such pressure. On the broader question about how to more comprehensively combat them, I mean, the strategy to challenge, confront, compete, undermine the axis of resistance has to be more comprehensive. It has to be more holistic. It cannot look at Hamas as an individual actor that swims on a tiny little island and has no connections outside of it. Likewise for Hezbollah, likewise with the proxies in Syria and Iraq, and the same, as Fatima has said, for the Houthis. They are part of this regional network, and Iran does form the glue that keeps it all together. Iran's assistance to Hezbollah years and years and years ago made Hezbollah into the very significant entity that it is today. And likewise, much more recently, for the Houthis. Without that assistance, intelligence, logistics, finances, weapons manufacturing, without any of that, these proxies would very swiftly crumble into the kind of weak domestic movements that they would otherwise be. So there has to be a more comprehensive approach to tackling Iran's willingness and ability to provide that kind of enormously strategic, significant assistance. At the same time, we also need to acknowledge, I think, better the domestic conditions in which these proxies operate. So much celebration, even to this day, continues around presenting the ceasefire in Yemen as a resolution to Yemen's conflict. Well, A, it's not a resolution to the civil conflict in Yemen. B, it's mostly advantageous to the Houthis. And C, eventually, all of that will probably blow up again in all of our faces at some point down the line. Much like Gaza, much like Syria appears to be on the brink of again now, 13 years later, after the start of its crisis. So to close out my answer, I would say, ultimately, the international community has to acknowledge and recognize that papering over crises in which troublesome militant actors operate is not a solution. It's never been a solution. And until we acknowledge that and we tackle some of those much more thorny, deeply rooted issues, we're just going to keep playing this game around. This video will continue to play on cycle. Nobody benefits from that other than these malign actors that we're talking about.
That's all we have time for today. I want to thank all three of my guests, our listeners for tuning in, as well as MEI's podcast producer, Elliot Sanders, for all of his work on this latest episode. Please read, listen to, and watch all of our coverage on Iran and its regional proxies on our website at www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Matthew Czekaj, and I invite you to listen again next time.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.